The frost hadn't burned off the grass yet when Mabel Forsythe started walking. October in the Harrow Creek Valley came early and stayed mean, and that first morning she dragged the handcart out from behind the barn. The wheels left twin black lines through the silver-white field, like something being written in a language nobody had bothered to translate. She didn't look back at the house. Looking back had stopped being useful sometime around April, when they lowered Harold into the ground behind the Methodist church in Caldwell, and the preacher said words that were kind, but landed wrong the way kind words often do when they're the only thing standing between a person and the full weight of what's happening. She had 11 acres. That was what remained of every decision Harold Forsythe had ever made with any optimism. 11 acres of eastern Kansas high plain, where the topsoil ran thin over a clay bed that turned to something close to concrete every August. Harold had known this when he bought it. He'd bought it anyway because the price was right and because Harold had a quality Mabel had loved and occasionally resented in equal measure, which was his absolute refusal to believe a thing couldn't be made to work. He'd planted young apple trees along the eastern slope, coaxed a kitchen garden out of the worst patch near the fence line, talked to the soil the way another man might talk to a difficult horse. The trees had mostly survived 2 dry summers through sheer stubbornness or Harold's stubbornness on their behalf. By the third summer without Harold, the two things were harder to tell apart. The well had gone dry in May, 6 weeks after the funeral. Mabel had stood at the edge of it, with a lantern held low, and looked down at the cracked mud at the bottom, and understood with complete clarity that grief was not going to be the thing that finished her. It was going to be arithmetic. She'd managed the household ledgers for 11 years. She knew exactly what the land owed and what it had produced, and the distance between those two numbers was not a gap anyone could pray closed. The bank in Caldwell held the note on the property. In September, a letter arrived in an envelope with the return address printed in precise small-type Gruel land in Credit Caldwell, Kansas. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph reminded her of the outstanding balance and the April due date. The second paragraph was a single sentence: Mr. Gruel would be available to discuss arrangements at her convenience. She'd set the letter on Harold's desk, which was her desk now, though she still thought of it as his. She'd made coffee, sat down, read the letter twice more. Then she'd folded it back into its envelope and placed it in the drawer beneath the ledger book. And she had not thought about Denton Gruel again until the morning he rode up the drive in November with clean boots and a patience about him that was more unsettling than anger would have been. She was carrying a bundle of deadfall from the tree line when his horse came through the gate. She didn't stop walking. He tied the horse at the post and waited, which told her something. A man who waited while a woman finished what she was doing either respected her time or had enough confidence in his own position that he didn't need to assert it. With Gruel, she suspected both were true. He was perhaps 60, with a gray beard kept neat and eyes that moved across the property the way a carpenter's eyes move across a room, noting load-bearing walls, identifying what would need to come down. He wore the vest and watch chain of a man who was not performing prosperity, but simply lived inside it without thinking much about it. He took off his hat when she set the bundle down near the barn. Mrs. Forsythe. His voice was measured, not warm exactly, but not cold. The voice of a man who had delivered difficult news enough times that he'd found the register that caused the least resistance. I hope the autumn's been manageable. She wiped her hands on her work apron. Mr. Gruel, you could have sent another letter. I could have. He glanced toward the eastern slope where the apple trees Harold had planted stood bare and thin against the gray sky. I find letters are better for numbers. Conversations are better for everything else. Then say what you came to say. He didn't flinch at the directness. If anything, something in his posture settled, like he appreciated being allowed to skip the part where they both pretended this was a social call. Mrs. Forsythe, you are a capable woman by all accounts. The note on this property comes due in April. The land has not produced sufficient revenue in 2 years to suggest April will be different. I have a buyer prepared to offer a fair price substantially above what you owe, which would leave you with funds to begin elsewhere without the burden of this debt. She looked at him steadily. You've had someone ready since September. Since August, he said without apology. I believe in preparation. I'll have what's owed by April. He held the hat in both hands, turned it once. Mrs. Forsythe, I have no interest in watching a woman struggle alone, What I'm describing is simply arithmetic. I understand arithmetic, Mr. Gruel. I kept the books for this property for 11 years. She picked up the bundle of branches again. I appreciate you making the trip. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, the way a person looks when they're revising an estimate. Then he put his hat back on, untied the horse, and rode back down the drive without another word. She watched him go and felt something that wasn't quite relief. He would come back. Men like Gruel always came back, not out of malice, but because they were right, and being right had a kind of gravity to it that eventually pulled everything in its direction. She carried the branches to the far side of the barn and added them to the pile she'd been building for 3 weeks. She had not told anyone what the pile was for. She wasn't sure she could have explained it yet, even if she'd wanted to. What she had was a single sentence in Harold's handwriting, not even Harold's own words, but his father's, copied into the back of the small notebook Harold kept in the breast pocket of his work coat. She'd found it while sorting through his things in June, when the grief had shifted from the kind that could flatten a person where they stood into the kind that could be folded up and carried while you washed dishes or repaired a fence post. Most of the notebook was figures: board feet of lumber, seed costs, the particular measurements of the east fence line. Near the very back, in slightly different ink, as though written at a different time and in a different frame of mind, were the words his father had told him years before. In the way old men sometimes say things that matter without announcing that they matter. Bury rotting wood beneath the beds. It remembers water when the sky forgets. Harold had never tried it. She didn't know if he disbelieved it or simply hadn't gotten to it. She didn't know if it was something his father had learned or something his father had invented. She didn't know if it worked. What she knew was that she had no money for irrigation equipment, no money for a deeper well, no money for anything that cost money, and that this idea cost nothing but time and labor and the willingness to collect what other people had already discarded. So she started walking. Every morning before the frost lifted, she took the handcart out and went to the neighboring farms in a circuit, always the same question delivered in the same even tone. She was clearing wood waste from the land. She'd be grateful for anything they wanted rid of. Broken branches, rotting deadfall, the tangled brush nobody had time to clear from the edges of their fields. She didn't explain further. Most people said yes without much curiosity. It cost them nothing to let a widow haul away their trash. At the Birch farm, Agnes Birch met her at the gate before she'd finished stopping the cart. Agnes was a broad, efficient woman who managed the Birch household with the same energy she applied to everything else, which was total and unapologetic. She had 4 children, a husband who deferred to her judgment on most matters, and an opinion about nearly everything that happened in the Harrow Creek Valley. "What do you want it for?" Agnes asked before Mabel had fully stopped the cart. "Clearing the land. Clearing it to where you've got brush piles already. I've seen them from the road." "I appreciate the question," Mabel said. "I'll try the Tully place next if it's not convenient." Agnes looked at the cart, looked at Mabel's hands, which were already rough and cracked at the knuckles from 3 weeks of this work, and something moved across her face that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite suspicion, and landed somewhere between the two. "I've got nothing I need cleared right now," she said, and that was the end of it. Mabel thanked her and moved on. She heard Agnes say something to whoever was behind her in the house, and the words didn't carry, but the tone did. And the tone was the one people used when they'd decided something about you and were confirming it to each other. She'd been hearing that tone since September, when she'd started turning down offers of help from the church auxiliary and the neighbor women who arrived with casseroles, in the particular manner of people who expected grief to make you agreeable. She wasn't disagreeable. She just didn't have time for casseroles. By mid-November, her hands had split at the knuckles from the cold wood. She wrapped them in strips of flour sack cloth in the mornings before she went out, and the cloth turned gray by noon, and she changed it in the evening. Her shoulders ached in a way that had nothing to do with grief, which she found she preferred. Physical pain was honest. It told you exactly what it was and where it came from, which was more than she could say for most things that had hurt her since April. By December, she had enough material to begin. She chose the eastern slope where Harold's apple trees already stood, because Harold's notes indicated the soil there retained moisture slightly longer than anywhere else on the property after rain. She'd never paid attention to this as a practical matter when Harold was alive. Now she'd mapped it herself over 4 months of deliberate watching, carrying his notebook and adding to it in the margins, noting where the morning fog lifted last, where frost stayed on the grass an hour longer than elsewhere, where the ground stayed dark and damp 2 days after a light rain when everywhere else had gone to dust. The mound she built was crude by any measure. She laid the largest branches first, the heaviest rotting wood she'd collected in a rough row about 8 feet long and 2 feet high. Over that she packed the smaller branches, the ones already softening with decay, filling in the gaps. Over that a layer of dead leaves from the elm trees near the creek bed tamped down with her boot. Over all of that soil, as much as she could move in a day, which was considerable. She'd been moving more than she thought she could every day since May. It looked like a long, low grave. She was aware of this. She built 5 more over the following 2 weeks, each one parallel to the last, running along the eastern slope in a row. From the road she knew they looked like nothing good. She knew because on the 3rd Saturday of December, Agnes Birch drove past in the Birch wagon with 2 of the children, and the wagon slowed and she could feel Agnes looking without needing to turn around. She didn't turn around. The blizzard came on January 12, 1888, without warning enough to matter. The morning had been cold but clear, the kind of clear that could fool a person who hadn't lived through enough Kansas winters. By noon, the temperature had dropped 25 degrees. By 2 in the afternoon, the sky had gone the color of a dirty sheet and the wind had picked up from the northwest with the specific intent of removing any remaining belief that the world was manageable. By 4, it was a whiteout. Mabel had brought the animals in by 3 when she saw how the light was changing. She'd done this because Harold had taught her what a certain color of afternoon sky meant in January, and Harold had been right about the sky even when he'd been wrong about other things. She got the 2 remaining chickens into the barn, got herself inside, got the door barred. She couldn't do anything about the mounds. She sat by the stove through the night with a blanket around her shoulders and listened to what the wind was doing to the eaves, to the fence line, to 11 years of decisions Harold had made with optimism. The sound a Kansas blizzard makes at full strength is not dramatic. It's beyond dramatic. It's the sound of something that doesn't know you exist and would not care if it did. In the morning, she dug herself out the back door. The temperature had come back up enough that the air no longer hurt to breathe. She walked to the eastern slope. The first mound was gone. Not entirely, but enough. The rain before the storm had loosened the soil she'd packed over the top, and the wind had sheared it off in a long diagonal gash, and what remained looked like something had been exhumed rather than buried. The branches beneath were exposed and dark against the snow. 2 other mounds had lost their covering partially. 3 had held more or less because of the angle they made with the hill. She stood in the snow and looked at the damage for a long time. The cold had stopped registering on her face about 10 minutes in. She was aware of it intellectually, the way you can be aware of something without fully processing it, because the thing you're looking at is taking up more of your attention than your body's discomfort can compete with. She sat down in the snow at the base of the ruined mound. She had not sat down anywhere outside since the morning after Harold's funeral, when she'd sat on the porch steps in her black dress and watched the sun come up because sleeping had stopped working and she'd needed to see something continue. This was different. She wasn't watching anything continue. She was sitting in the snow looking at a mound of branches she'd spent 2 months collecting, which had taken 20 minutes of wind to partially undo, and she was trying to decide what she felt about that. She opened her mouth and talked to Harold. She hadn't done this before, not out loud, not outside the territory of her own head. It wasn't prayer. It wasn't grief exactly. It was more like a report. She told him about the mounds, what she'd built, and where she'd gotten the idea. She told him she didn't know if his father had known what he was talking about, or if it was one of those things old men said because they lived long enough to have opinions about everything. She told him the blizzard had taken the top off the first one, and she was going to have to rebuild it. She told him she was going to rebuild it because she didn't have any other idea, and she'd like another idea if he had one, but she wasn't expecting one. She sat there until her hands were genuinely cold through the cloth wrappings. Then she stood up, brushed the snow off the back of her coat, and walked back to the house to start water heating for coffee. She rebuilt the first mound 3 days later, angled differently. This time, the long axis running perpendicular to the northwestern wind direction she'd noted in Harold's book. She packed the soil tighter using water to help it compact, which meant working in the cold with wet hands, which she did for 4 days until the covering was dense enough to resist what she expected the rest of winter to try. She was not certain this would work. She was becoming certain that certainty was a luxury that required more resources than she currently had access to. In February, a windstorm came through on a Wednesday night and tore the covering off the second mound. She spent 2 days repacking it. In March, deer found the tender cover crop shoots she'd managed to coax up on the third mound from seed she'd been saving since October and stripped it to bare dirt. She spent a week fencing the mounds with the deadfall she hadn't yet buried, pounding branches into the frozen ground at angles, weaving them together into something that a deer would find annoying enough to bypass. It was ugly. It was effective. Agnes Birch drove past while she was doing it, slowed the wagon, kept going. Mabel didn't look up from the fencing. In March, Ezra Polk came through on his seasonal route selling seed and equipment. He was a man of perhaps 70, leather-faced, with the kind of economy of movement that came from decades of covering territory in every weather condition Kansas had to offer. He pulled his wagon into the drive without being invited because he'd been stopping at the Forsyth farm for 8 years, and the habit was stronger than the changed circumstances. He climbed down, looked at the mounds, walked toward them without asking permission. She watched him from the barn door. He walked the full length of the row, bent at the waist, over one of the mounds to examine the layering, where the soil had partially cracked, along the edge straightened, looked at the fencing around the third mound, looked back at her. "Where'd you come by this?" His voice had the quality of a man who asked questions because he wanted answers, not because he was being polite. She crossed the yard to where he stood. Harold's father mentioned it once. Harold wrote it down. Ezra nodded slowly, the way people nod when something confirms what they'd half believed. Saw something like it once. Indiana Farm, 1869. Drought came through, took everything for 20 miles. That farm kept half its trees. He crouched down at the edge of the nearest mound, pressed 2 fingers into the soil. "You've got the layers right mostly. What you want is your coarse wood on the bottom, the stuff that'll take years to break down. Your finer material already starting to soften, in the middle where it'll work faster. Then your leaf matter on top of that before the soil. The leaves hold a pocket of air, slows the breakdown just enough to make it go even over years instead of fast at first, and then nothing." She pulled out Harold's notebook, which she'd taken to keeping in her coat pocket. She wrote while he talked. He gave her 2 more specifics: depth of soil covering in clay ground versus loam, and the value of letting the mound settle 1 full week before planting into it. When he was done, he stood up and looked out over the slope. "Give it 2 summers," he said. "You'll know by the second one whether it's working." He sold her a packet of apple whip graphs at cost, which she understood to be a form of kindness from a man who expressed kindness through practical transactions. He climbed back on the wagon and continued his route. He did not offer reassurance. She didn't need it. She needed the information about the leaf layer, which she now had. She rebuilt the 2 earliest mounds, partially adding leaf matter between the branches and the soil where the structure allowed her to work it in. She couldn't fully correct the first 2 without dismantling them, which she decided against. The wood had already been settling for 4 months. She would let them continue and see what the second summer said. She planted the apple whips Ezra had sold her directly into the mounds in April, 18 bare switches that looked like they'd been cut from a hedge and stuck in the ground with more hope than evidence. She scattered cover crop seed around the base of each one, a low-growing grass mix she'd bought with the last of a small amount of money she'd been keeping separate in a tin behind the flour bin. Money she had not told Denton Gruel existed because it wasn't his arithmetic's business. In March, 2 weeks before she'd gone to buy the apple whip graphs, Gruel had sent a second letter. The envelope was the same. The return address was the same. The first paragraph restated the April due date with the addition of a specific figure, the precise dollar amount required by the 14th. The second paragraph was longer. This time he had identified a buyer willing to proceed immediately at a price that would clear the debt and leave her with a remainder that would, he suggested with the phrasing of a man who chose every word before writing it, allow her to secure more suitable accommodations elsewhere. He remained available to discuss arrangements. She'd read it twice, put it in the drawer with the first one, and driven herself to Caldwell the following week. Gruel's office was on the second floor of a building on the main commercial street, with windows that looked out over the roof lines toward the flat country beyond town. He was at his desk when his clerk showed her in, and he stood with the manners of a man who'd been raised to stand when a woman entered a room, regardless of what business that woman was there to conduct. He did not look surprised to see her, but something in the set of his mouth shifted slightly. She suspected he'd expected another letter in return, not the woman herself. She sat in the chair across his desk, put her hands in her lap, and made her case in the way she'd made it to herself over 3 weeks of building and rebuilding and losing and rebuilding again. She was not asking for the debt to be forgiven. She was asking for time. Specifically, she was asking for an extension to October of 1888, 6 additional months to demonstrate that the land was capable of producing. She had made specific changes to the land that she believed would change its yield. She could not guarantee the outcome. She could guarantee the attempt. Gruel listened without interrupting, which she noted. He leaned back in his chair when she finished, looked at the window for a moment, then back at her. October, he said. October. He turned a pen slowly between his fingers. The land showed nothing productive in either of the 2 previous full seasons, Mrs. Forsyth. Correct. And what you're describing is a method you've derived from a note in your late husband's book. His father's knowledge, yes, which has not been tested on this specific soil. Not yet. He looked at her in the way he'd looked at her in November, the way of revising an estimate. Then he looked at the pen in his hand as though he'd only just noticed it was there. October 14th, he said. I'll need to see evidence of a productive crop in progress. Not a promise. Evidence. Understood. He wrote the amendment into the note and she signed it. Walking down the stairs and out onto the street, she felt the particular sensation of having traded something she couldn't afford to trade. For time she might not be able to use, and she understood that this was probably what Harold had felt when he'd signed the original note, and the understanding made her feel closer to him than anything had since June. The cover crop came up in May, around the base of the apple whips, low and green and unremarkable. The whips themselves were still bare wood in May. In June, 3 of them began showing the smallest possible leaves, the kind that required looking closely and in good light to confirm they were actually there. One of the first-year whips died by June, the one she'd planted in the most poorly corrected mound. She pulled it and noted which mound it was and added it to her records. 17 trees remain. They did not look like an orchard. They looked like a woman's idea of an orchard that had not yet convinced anyone, including possibly the woman. She kept the notebook with her, always now writing in it each morning before she went out, where the frost had settled overnight, how long it took to lift, which direction the ground was driest by afternoon. She was learning the land the way Harold had known it, but differently. Harold had known it through years of working it without fully questioning it. She was questioning everything, turning each observation into a note, each note into a pattern, each pattern into a decision. The notebook had begun as Harold's. It was becoming something else. By the end of June, the valley knew she was growing something in the mounds, though none of them knew what she expected to come of it. Sam Birch Clem, she'd learned his given name was Clem, though Agnes always called him Sam, which confused visitors had driven past twice and slowed both times. Ward Tully from the northern end of the valley had stopped at the fence line on his horse. One afternoon looked at the slope for a long moment, then ridden on without comment. She planted a kitchen garden near the house as well. Smaller than Harold's had been, but more deliberate, using everything Ezra Polk's information had taught her about water retention. Deep planting, heavy mulch, no bare soil exposed to the August sun. It was not spectacular. It produced enough to reduce what she needed to buy from town by a meaningful fraction, and fractions mattered when you were doing the arithmetic Mabel Forsyth was doing every night at Harold's desk by lamplight. The summer of 1888 passed without catastrophe, which in Kansas meant it had been a test rather than a verdict. The rains came intermittently and inadequately, as they had for 3 years. The apple whips held their leaves through July and August, which was more than she'd expected from trees in their first year in the ground. They didn't grow much. They didn't die. They were doing what she needed them to do, which was persist. In the fall, the cover crop browned off around the bases of the trees in the ordinary way of things, which was what it was supposed to do, decomposing back into the soil around the graft points, feeding the roots below, with what it had taken from the air. She watched this happen the way she'd watched the children in Harold's family grow when they'd visited years ago, with the understanding that important things sometimes look like nothing for long stretches before they look like something. The October deadline came. Gruel arrived on October 15th, one day late, which she suspected was deliberate, the way a man signals ease with a situation by declining to rush it. She met him at the gate. He walked the eastern slope with her without speaking. Much looked at the cover crop stubble, looked at the apple whips, which had put on perhaps 8 inches of growth in their first season, and were now dormant bare sticks again, but thicker sticks than they'd been in April. He bent at the base of one and pressed 2 fingers into the soil the way Ezra Polk had done in March. He stood up. He looked at the sky for a moment, the particular gray of October afternoon in eastern Kansas, and something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read, but that she did not think was disappointment. "These are first-year trees," he said. "Yes. They won't produce in the second year either, in all likelihood. The second year will tell more than the first." He turned the hat brim in his hands. He did not have the look of a man preparing to foreclose. He had the look she thought of a man doing arithmetic and finding the numbers had moved. "I'll send a revised letter," he said finally, "through spring of next year, at which point I'll need more than potential Mrs. Forsythe." She nodded once. He walked back to his horse. She stayed at the edge of the slope and watched him go, and she thought about what it meant that he'd looked at those small bare trees and found something worth waiting on, even though she suspected his reasons had more to do with his investment than with any belief in her. She didn't mind. Belief in her was not what she needed from Denton Gruel. She needed his patience, and she was learning to take the things she needed from the places they were available, which was not always where she'd have chosen. That night she sat by the stove and opened the notebook and turned to the back page where Harold's father's words were written in Harold's hand. She read them again, then looked at what she had written in the margins around them and below them, and in the 6 pages after them, 2 years of observations that had outgrown the space Harold had left. She put her hand on the page, palm flat, the way you might put your hand on something to confirm it's real. The paper was cool from the draft that came under the door. She kept her hand there for a moment, feeling the raised texture of the pencil lines she'd made since June, the record of every morning she'd gone out and looked carefully at what the land was doing. She did not know yet what the second summer would say. But she had learned to read the questions correctly, and that was she was beginning to understand the harder part. The winter of 1888 into 1889 was the kind that didn't announce itself with drama. It arrived the way debt did, quietly, incrementally each week, a little colder than the last, until the cold was simply the condition of everything, and you stopped expecting anything different. Mabel had learned to stop expecting different things. She'd found it was more useful to expect the specific thing that was actually coming and prepare for that instead. She worked the mounds through November on the days when the ground wasn't frozen solid, tamping loose soil back where the autumn rains had shifted it, reinforcing the branch fencing around the 3 mounds that the deer had found most interesting. She'd learned their patterns now, which direction they came from before dawn, which mounds sat in their line of approach. She'd added height to the fencing on the northwest side of mounds 3 and 4, woven in additional deadfall at an outward angle that made the barrier less like an obstacle and more like something actively unpleasant to push against. The deer stopped trying after the first week of November. She allowed herself to notice this as a small, precise victory, not the kind worth speaking aloud, the kind worth writing in the notebook and then continuing. Gruel's letter arrived in the second week of November as he'd said it would. The revised terms were as he'd described at the fence line in October extension through May of 1889, with the expectation of demonstrable crop progress. The language was careful and fair in the way that language written by a man who expected to be held to it tends to be. She read it twice, added it to the drawer with the others, noted the date in Harold's notebook, and returned to the question of how to get the kitchen garden's root vegetables through the rest of winter without the root cellar, which had partially collapsed in the blizzard, and which she had not had time or money to repair. She solved this with a method she found in a farming almanac she'd borrowed from the Tully farm in September, which involved burying the vegetables in sand in wooden boxes kept in the warmest corner of the barn. It was not elegant. It worked. She was finding that most things which worked were not elegant, that elegance was generally a quality that could be added later once the fundamental problem had been solved, and that most people who insisted on elegance first were people who had not yet been required to solve fundamental problems under time pressure with limited materials. December came. The apple whips were bare and dormant on the slope, invisible from the road under the snowfall that came in the third week. If someone had driven past the Forsyth farm in January of 1889 and looked toward the eastern slope, they would have seen nothing but snow. What was underneath the snow was not visible and would not be visible until spring, and what was underneath the mound surfaces below the soil, below the leaf layer, below the finer decomposing wood in the middle, the heavy rotting logs at the bottom slowly releasing the water they'd absorbed in every rain since April that was not visible at all to anyone, including Mabel. She understood this. She had been working for over a year on something she could not see the results of yet, which required a specific quality she was still in the process of developing, which was the ability to trust work she couldn't verify. Harold had possessed this quality naturally. She was having to build it the way she'd built the mounds, layer by layer, the evidence accumulating too slowly to be satisfying, but steadily enough to continue on. On a Thursday evening in December, she was sitting at Harold's desk with the notebook open, not writing, just looking at the entries from the previous 6 months, when she felt the particular quality of silence that the house had taken on since April settled around her in a way she hadn't let herself notice before. She'd been keeping herself too busy to notice. The busyness had been deliberate, a management strategy as much as a practical necessity, because the silence in a house where someone is missing has a specific texture that can stop you cold if you give it room. She let it have room that Thursday in December. She sat with it for a while, the lamp burning low, the stove ticking as it cooled toward the end of its fuel. She thought about Harold, not in the way she usually thought about him, which was as a source of practical information, the things he'd known about the land, the notes he'd left, the memories she was still mining for anything useful. She thought about him as the specific person he'd been, the way he'd drunk his coffee standing up every morning because he couldn't wait to get outside, the way he'd talked to the difficult sections of ground, the same way she'd talked to him in the snow after the blizzard, as though the ground might respond if you just found the right register. She didn't cry. She'd done most of her crying in the first 2 months privately in the early mornings before she had to be practical. What she felt in December at the desk was something quieter than grief and more durable. The understanding that the notebook on the desk in front of her contained both his handwriting and hers, that the line between what he'd known and what she'd learned from knowing him was no longer a line she could find clearly. She was not sure she needed to find it. She closed the notebook, turned down the lamp, went to bed. January 1889 came in mild, which nobody in the valley trusted. A mild January in Kansas meant something was being stored up, redistributed. The cold was not gone, it was deferred. She used the mild weeks to finish reinforcing the remaining mound fencing, to cut and stack additional cover crop seeds she'd let go to head in the kitchen garden, to dig out and repair the partial collapse in the root cellar that she'd been working around since February of the previous year. The repair took 2 weeks of work she fit into the hours between her other work, and when it was done, the root cellar was not as good as it had been when Harold had maintained it, but it was functional, which was the standard she was applying to everything. February. The mild weeks ended. Cold came in from the northwest with something in it that felt like a reassertion of order, the natural world correcting an oversight. She kept the animals in. She kept herself in on the worst days, which she spent at the desk with the ledger and the notebook, working through the numbers she knew and the projections she could build from them. The apple trees, if the mounds were doing what she believed they were doing, and if the second summer proved it would begin producing in their third year in the ground. Third year was 1891. She had a note extended to May of 1889. She had no idea what Gruel would do in May of 1889 because she had not yet given him anything that looked like a producing orchard, only a slope of dormant trees that might or might not survive into summer. What she needed was for the summer of 1889 to be a hard summer. Dry. The kind of dry that showed the difference between ground that held water and ground that didn't. She was aware that this was a strange thing to need. She was also aware that Kansas had a reliable tendency to provide hard summers, and that this might be the only place in her current circumstances where what she needed and what was probable were pointing in the same direction. March came. The ground thawed in the top 2 inches by mid-month. She opened the mounds carefully at the edges to check the internal moisture, pressing a stick down through the soil layer to where she could feel the change in temperature. the cooler interior where the wood was breaking down. The wood was darker than it had been when she'd buried it. It had the smell of forest floor, deep and mineral and slightly sweet. The smell of something transforming at its own pace regardless of what the surface was doing. She pressed her palm against the inner soil of mound number 3, the one that had been stripped by deer twice and rebuilt from scratch, the one she'd been most uncertain about. It was damp. Not wet. Damp. The kind of damp that didn't happen in eastern Kansas clay in March without intervention. She sat back on her heels and looked at her hand. The dampness was real. She hadn't imagined it. She'd also learned enough in the past 18 months to not treat one piece of data as a conclusion, so she simply noted it in the notebook, added the date, added the specific location and depth, and moved on to check the next mound. All 6 showed interior moisture. The 2 earliest mounds, the ones she'd built before Ezra Polk's correction in March of 1888, showed less than the 4 she'd built with the proper layering. The difference was measurable. She noted this too. In April, she planted the cover crop around the bases of the trees again, the same low-growing grass mix she'd used the previous year, with the addition of a small amount of clover she'd traded 2 jars of preserved tomatoes for at the Tully farm. Clover fixed something into the soil that grass didn't, something she'd read about in the almanac in terms she only partly understood, but had noted carefully anyway. Ward Tully had watched her work the soil around the trees when she'd gone to the Tully farm for the trade, because Ward's farm backed up to the Forsyth property at the northeast corner, and he had a clear view of her slope from his highest field. He was a man of moderate ambition and significant patience, which in farming was roughly the correct combination. He'd been curious about the mounds since the previous summer without having found a way to ask about them that didn't feel like an intrusion into a widow's private management decisions. "What's the clover for?" he said when she was leaving. She told him briefly. He listened the way Ezra Polk had listened, with the attention of a man who was updating his understanding of something, not simply receiving information. She showed him the moisture data in the notebook, the comparison between the 4 correctly layered mounds and the 2 earlier ones. He looked at the numbers. The layering matters that much. "The layering is the difference between damp and dry in the second March," she said. "I don't know yet what that means by August." She found out in July. The summer of 1889 arrived in June as a slow-building heat that didn't break in July the way Kansas summers usually broke, with an afternoon storm that cooled things for 2 weeks before the heat returned. July stayed hot. Wells across Comanche County dropped in the first week. By the 3rd week of July, 2 farms at the southern end of the valley had lost standing corn, the stalks gone pale and papery in the way that meant the root systems had given up. The Harrow Creek itself dropped to a trickle by the last week of the month, exposing the pale clay of its bed in long, dry stretches. Mabel's kitchen garden was struggling. She'd mulched it heavily, and she was carrying water from the house cistern every morning, a limited supply that she was rationing with the same calculation she applied to the ledger. The garden would produce less than she'd planned. She'd already adjusted her autumn purchasing figures accordingly. But the apple trees on the eastern slope were not struggling. They were not flourishing in any spectacular sense. They were second-year trees, most with the slender trunk diameter of a good walking stick, their canopies modest. They were not going to impress anyone who didn't know what second-year apple trees in a dry Kansas summer were supposed to look like. What they were doing was holding their leaves. Green leaves in the last week of July, in a summer that had taken the color out of everything else within visible distance. Clem Birch came past on a Wednesday afternoon, driving the wagon toward Caldwell with a look on his face that she recognized from her own mirror in the months after the well went dry, the look of a person recalculating what options remain when the ones they'd counted on have been removed. His corn was not doing well. She'd heard this from Ward Tully, not as gossip, but as the kind of information that circulates in farming communities because it's relevant to everyone. He pulled the wagon over without premeditation, the way a person stops when something doesn't fit what they expect to see, and their eyes need a moment to work it out. He climbed down. He walked through the gate without asking which she noted, but didn't comment on, because he walked with the distracted manner of a man who wasn't registering social conventions at that particular moment, only the thing his eyes were trying to understand. He went to the nearest tree. He crouched at its base the way Ezra Polk had crouched at the mound edge 16 months earlier, pressing 2 fingers into the soil. He kept them there for a moment. He stood. He looked at her where she stood at the edge of the slope, watching him. His face had the expression of someone who has just been shown that a fact they considered fixed is actually variable, and who isn't sure whether to feel relieved or unsettled by this. How, he said, not quite a question, more like the first word of a sentence he hadn't finished forming. She walked toward him. The branches, she said, the ones people were throwing out. They're not garbage in the ground, Clem. They're water the earth borrowed and hasn't spent yet. He looked down at the soil around the tree base again, then at the tree, then along the row of trees behind it. All 6 mounds. All 6. The 4 I built correctly are doing better than the 2 I built before I knew what I was doing, but all 6 are working. He straightened fully. He was a quiet man with a farmer's habit of letting information settle before he responded to it. He looked at the nearest mound's surface, at the way the grass cover was browned at the tips from the heat, but still rooted, still present, when everywhere else had gone to bare, cracked dirt. Agnes said you were burying garbage. Agnes wasn't wrong about what I was carrying. He stood there for a moment. I've got 40 acres of corn that's not going to make it to harvest. She didn't offer sympathy. He hadn't come for sympathy. He'd stopped the wagon because he'd seen something that didn't fit what the summer was doing to everything else, and he needed to understand it because understanding it was the only way it became useful. What do you want to know? She said. He came back the following week. He came back the week after that. He stopped pretending he was passing by on the 3rd visit, which she took as a kind of integrity. He asked precise questions, and she answered precisely with reference to the notebook when the specific measurements mattered. She showed him the difference between the first 2 mounds and the last 4, the visible differential in leaf color and growth rate between the trees above each type. She showed him where the deer fencing had failed and been rebuilt, and why the final method had held when the earlier ones hadn't. He never said he'd been wrong to doubt her. He didn't need to. He was here asking questions, taking out a small folded piece of paper and a stub of pencil to write things down. That was its own kind of statement, and it was the kind she respected. In August, Denton Gruel came back. She saw his horse from across the field and took a moment, just a moment before walking toward the gate. She used the moment to look at the slope the way he would see it, trying to see it without the context of the 18 months she'd spent building it. 16 apple trees with green leaves in a summer that had dried out 2 farms at the southern end of the valley. Cover crop stubble still rooted between them. The branch fencing weathered but standing. The mounds themselves invisible beneath the soil surface, doing their work below the threshold of what anyone standing at a fence line could observe. She went to meet him. He had the same neat vest, the same measured patience in his posture. He dismounted, tied the horse, looked toward the slope before looking at her. It was the first time she'd seen him look at something other than her when he arrived, which she noted as a change in the arithmetic. I heard the Harrow Creek dropped, he said, 3 weeks ago. I heard the birch corn is a loss this year. Most of the south end of the valley. He looked at the slope again, at the green in it, at the specific green that meant alive in a summer that was systematically removing that color from the landscape in the way a fire removes what it passes through. The trees, he said, 2nd year, not producing yet, but alive. Very much so. He walked toward the gate, paused with his hand on it, looked at her with the question he'd been carrying since he'd ridden up the drive, the question that was not about sentiment or charity, but about the thing he actually dealt in, which was land and its productive capacity. How? She didn't hesitate. She told him exactly what was under those mounds. She told him what Ezra Polk had confirmed and corrected. She told him how long she'd been collecting the material and where it had come from, and why the layering sequence mattered. She told him about Harold's father's words in the notebook where the whole thing had started. 1 sentence written in one man's handwriting in a coat pocket, found by a woman cleaning out a dead man's belongings because she didn't have any other ideas. Gruel listened the way he did, everything with complete attention and no visible emotional reaction. When she finished, he stood for a moment looking at the nearest tree. The first-year trees are doing better than those 2 at the far end, he said. It was not a question. He'd already seen it. The 2 at the far end were built before I had the correct technique. I didn't correct them fully because the wood had already settled. He nodded once. He turned the hat brim in his hands. He looked at the slope for another long moment, and she could see him doing what he always did, which was revising a calculation, this time with new variables. Mrs. Forsyth, he said finally, his voice carrying the particular quality it had when he was settling a matter rather than opening one. I believe the terms we last discussed no longer apply in the way I'd anticipated. He looked at her directly. The land speaks for itself. She said nothing. She held his gaze. I'll have the amendment drawn up, he said. There's no need for a May meeting. He put his hat on. I'll need to inform my buyer that the situation has changed. He walked back to his horse. He mounted with the ease of a man who rode every day of his life. He turned the horse toward the gate, then paused. The method, he said, not looking at her but toward the road. The layering you described, is it in writing somewhere? In my notebook. He nodded once more to no one in particular and rode down the drive. She stood at the edge of the slope after his horse had disappeared past the tree line and looked at the 16 trees she'd put in the ground in April of the previous year. Bare switches planted in raised mounds of buried wood that everyone in the valley had considered either pointless or evidence of grief making a person strange. The leaves caught the late afternoon light the way only living things catch it from the inside out. She stood there until the light changed. Agnes Birch came on a Saturday in September, 3 weeks after Gruel's horse had disappeared down the drive. She came alone without the children, which told Mabel something. A woman who left the children at home had made a decision before she arrived rather than in the moment. She pulled the wagon to the gate and climbed down with a basket over one arm, the kind of basket that required 2 hands to carry when full. She walked to where Mabel was working at the near edge of the slope, tamping soil back around a mound that had shifted slightly along its eastern face after a hard rain the previous week. Mabel heard the footsteps and straightened but didn't move toward her. Agnes set the basket down on the ground between them. 6 jars of preserves put up with the careful hand of a woman who had been doing this since she was 12 and took no shortcuts. Peach 2 of them. Apple butter, which required fruit she'd have had to buy this year, given the summer they'd all had. Mabel looked at the basket and then at Agnes. Agnes was looking at the slope, at the trees, at the way the cover crop had browned to straw at the tips, but remained rooted while the birch fields 2 properties over had gone to powder by the end of July. Her face had the expression of a woman who had prepared several things to say and had decided upon arrival against all of them. Clem says you'd show anyone who asked, Agnes said finally. Her voice carried the particular flatness of a person who was being precise rather than cold. I'm asking. Mabel looked at her for a moment. Agnes did not look back. She was still looking at the trees, at the mounds, at the evidence she'd driven past for nearly 2 years, while forming opinions about it from a moving wagon. Mabel opened the gate. She walked Agnes along the slope, the way she'd walked Clem, the way she'd walked Ward Tully, the way she'd walked Ezra Polk in reverse, answering his method with her results. She didn't soften the explanation or expand it with anything unnecessary. She said what was true about the layering, about the wood and the leaf matter, and the soil depth, about the difference between the first 2 mounds and the last 4, about what the interior moisture had looked like in March when she checked it with a stick pressed down through the surface. Agnes listened without asking questions, which was unusual for Agnes, and walked where Mabel walked and looked where Mabel pointed. At the second mound from the end, the one that had failed twice and been rebuilt from scratch, Agnes crouched down without being invited and pressed her fingers into the soil at the base of the tree, the way the men had done, the way people always did when the explanation ran ahead of what they could believe, and they needed their hands to confirm it. She held them there. She stood. She picked up the basket from where she'd left it at the edge of the slope and carried it to the porch steps and set it down. She did not hand it to Mabel. She set it down and walked back to her wagon. She climbed up, took the reins, and looked once at the slope before turning the horse toward the road. She did not look at Mabel. Mabel watched the wagon reach the road and turn north toward the birch farm. She put her hand on top of the nearest jar, the glass cool and smooth under her palm. She stood there a moment. Then she carried the basket inside and went back to the slope to finish tamping the mound. By October, the valley had processed what the summer had shown it, the way communities process things slowly and without acknowledgement, the way water finds a new level after a flood without anyone directing it. Clem Birch had begun collecting deadfall from his own tree line, had sent his oldest boy twice to ask if Mabel had surplus branches she didn't need. Ward Tully had stopped at the fence one afternoon with a direct question about the depth of the initial wood layer, written her answer in the folded paper he kept in his coat pocket, and disappeared back toward his north field without ceremony. She did not receive apologies. She had not expected them. An apology required a person to stop moving forward long enough to look back. And these were farming people in a hard year, and looking back was a luxury they shared with no one. What she received instead was attention, the specific quality of attention that people pay to someone who has solved a problem they are also trying to solve, which is not warm exactly but is deeply practically real. She found she preferred it to warmth. In November, Ward Tully knocked at the door on a weekday afternoon with Harold's notebook in his hand. He'd borrowed it 3 weeks earlier, the section she'd permitted him to copy the moisture records, the layering specifications, the seasonal notes about frost patterns on the slope. He returned it with the care of a man returning something irreplaceable, holding it with both hands, setting it on the table rather than putting it in her hand, as though he wanted to be certain it made it back to a stable surface. "I copied what I needed," he said. "The section about checking internal moisture in early spring. I want to do that before I plant." She turned the notebook over in her hands, checking the binding, finding it intact. "How many mounds are you building?" "4 to start, along my northeast section where the clay runs deepest." He paused. "I showed the copy to Harlan Stokes at the south end. He wants to try 2 mounds before spring." She looked up from the notebook. Harlan Stokes had been one of the farmers who'd lost corn in July. He'd driven past the Forsyth farm twice in August without stopping. She nodded once. Ward put his hat on and left. She stood at the table after the door closed and looked at the notebook in her hands, at the cover, worn soft from a year of daily handling, at the spine, where the glue had softened and rehardened through 2 winters of temperature changes, in her coat pocket. She opened it to the back, to Harold's father's words in Harold's hand. The sentence that had been there for years while Harold was alive, and that she had read perhaps 200 times in the 19 months since she'd found it. Below it, her own handwriting filled the remaining pages and had wrapped around into the front matter and the margins Harold had left blank. The notebook had started as his. It had not stopped being his. It had simply become hers as well, the way the land had become hers, not by replacement, but by continuation, one set of knowledge extending into another. She carried it to the desk, sat down, and opened it to the most recent entry. She wrote the date, November 14th, 1889. Below the date, she wrote Ward Tully's name, and Harlan Stokes's name, and the number 4 and the number 2. 6 mounds in ground that was not hers, from knowledge that had passed through 3 pairs of hands before reaching those specific fields. She looked at what she'd written for a moment, then closed the notebook. December arrived. The apple trees were bare again on the slope, their second dormant winter, their trunks marginally thicker than they'd been 12 months earlier. Their root systems doing in the dark what root systems do when no one is watching, which is the most important work. She didn't check the internal mound moisture in December. It was too early in the cold. She would check in March, as she had the 2 previous years, and the data would tell her what the summer had stored. On a Thursday evening in the second week of December, she sat in Harold's chair by the stove with the lamp turned low because the oil was running toward the end of the month's supply, and she'd learned to conserve it in the last third of each month. The house was quiet in the specific way it was always quiet, the particular quiet of a house built for more people than were in it. She had stopped managing this the way she'd managed it for the first year, filling the hours, keeping herself moving. She let it be quiet. She thought about the season ending. Not with grief and not with relief exactly, but with something that had the quality of both without being either. The summer of 1889 had been the test she'd understood she needed. The trees had passed it. The mounds had done what the wood in the ground was supposed to do, held the water released. It slowly fed the roots above through the dry weeks, when everything else in the valley was telling its trees there was nothing left to give. She had not imagined this outcome in any specific way when she'd carried the first load of deadfall from the Tully property in October of 1887. She had only understood that the alternative, which was selling the land and starting elsewhere, with whatever gruel's offer left in her pocket, would mean that Harold's father's sentence in Harold's coat pocket would die with the transaction. She had not been able to let that happen. She was not certain she could have explained why not in the first months, not in a way that would have satisfied a person looking for logic. There was logic in it, but the logic had come after. What came first was something more like stubbornness, or maybe obligation. The sense that a thing written down, because someone once thought it was worth writing down, deserved at least one attempt to find out if they were right. She was warm by the stove. She was not worrying about the land. She had not been worrying about the land, she realized, since sometime in August, since the afternoon she'd stood in the slope light after Gruel's horse had gone and felt the work shift from emergency into something else. She was not sure yet what to call the something else, but she recognized it as the first season she'd lived through since Harold's death, in which she'd arrived at December without the specific, grinding weight of trying to keep herself from losing the ground beneath her feet. She sat with this for a while, just sat with it, which was its own kind of skill, one she'd been slower to learn than the moisture checking and the fencing and the ledger work. She went to bed at a reasonable hour. The spring of 1890 came in wet, which was the valley's apology for the previous summer if the valley had been capable of apologies. The creek ran full through March. The mounds absorbed the rain the way she'd built them to absorb it, the wood layers filling like slow sponges, storing against the dry months that might or might not follow. She checked the internal moisture in March as she always did. All 6 mounds were damp below the surface. The 4 later mounds were notably wetter than the 2 early ones. She noted this in the notebook the 3rd consecutive spring, where the same differential appeared, which made it a pattern rather than an observation. The apple trees broke dormancy in late March, earlier than the previous year, which meant the root systems had gone deeper over the winter, had found what was stored below, had decided it was worth reaching for. The first buds appeared in the first week of April, small and tight as fists, and then by the 3rd week they were something else entirely, opening along the branches, in the sequence that apple trees have followed longer than Kansas has been Kansas. Ward Tully rode past on April 18th and stopped at the fence without dismounting. He looked at the slope for a long moment. "They're going to produce," he said. "Some of them," she said. "First year of fruit. It won't be much." "It'll be something." She looked at the trees herself, at the white opening along 16 sets of branches in the April morning, and thought about something being the operative distinction. Something from nothing. Something from rotten wood and dead branches and the frost-cracked hands of a woman who hadn't known what she was doing but had written down everything she observed and kept trying until the trying became method. The blossoms held through May, which required the specific cooperation of a Kansas spring that was frequently uncooperative, and some of them did not hold a late frost on May 3rd, taking perhaps a quarter of the blossoms on the 2 least protected trees at the western end of the row. She had expected losses. She'd planned for them in the ledger. What remained after the frost was still more than she'd let herself count on in the quiet accounting she did by lamplight. The numbers she kept separate from the official ledger because they were too contingent to write down in ink. The fruit set in June, small hard green the size of large marbles clinging to the branches with the specific determination of things that have made it through multiple rounds of elimination. She walked the rows every few days, noting which trees were carrying most heavily, which ones were still finding their production rhythm. The 4 mounds built correctly were outperforming the 2 early ones in fruit load, as they had in every other measurable quality, which she noted in the notebook without satisfaction and without surprise, because she'd seen this differential in every season since the first spring, and it was no longer a revelation, only a confirmation. By August, the fruit had sized up to the point where a person driving past on the road could see that there was something on those trees, that the eastern slope of the Forsyth farm had produced something that looked from a distance like an orchard beginning to become itself. Agnes Birch drove past in August, slowed at the slope the way she always slowed, and this time she stopped the wagon fully. She looked for a long moment. She drove on. That afternoon, a boy came to the gate from the Birch farm, Agnes's second oldest, with a note. The note asked if Mrs. Forsyth would be willing to sell a quantity of apples at harvest time to be agreed upon at market rate. The note was written in Agnes's precise handwriting, with no preamble and no reference to anything that had happened in the previous 2 years. It was a commercial inquiry from one neighbor to another. Mabel wrote back on the same paper below Agnes's lines, agreeing to the sale at market rate and noting the expected harvest window. She sent the boy back with it. In September, the road in front of the Forsyth farm saw more wagon traffic than it had seen since the week of Harold's funeral, which had been the last occasion that had drawn people to the property in numbers. The wagons came for different reasons now. Clem Birch came with his oldest two children to collect the agreed bushels, the children running the rows with the energy of children who have been told they can do this, their hands sticky by the time they'd filled the third crate. Ward Tully came with a wagon and his wife, who said little but looked at everything carefully. Harlan Stokes came alone, bought a small amount, stood at the edge of the slope with the look of a man doing extended internal calculations before heading back to his wagon. The smell of ripe apples reached the road. Mabel had not expected to notice this as a specific thing, but she noticed it. The smell of ripe apples in September on land, where 2 dry summers had nearly ended everything, where a banknote had once felt like a door closing, where she'd sat in the snow after a blizzard and talked to a dead man about whether one sentence in a coat pocket notebook was worth staking 11 acres on. The smell reached the road. People stopped when they smelled it. She sold everything she'd expected to sell. Then she sold a quantity beyond what she'd expected because word had moved in the way it moved in farming communities, which was at the speed of something useful, faster than gossip, but with less drama. She noted the final figures in the ledger on a Saturday evening in late September, and the figures were not spectacular by any standard that would matter to someone keeping score in a larger context. They were, however, sufficient to retire the remaining balance on the gruel note with a figure left over. She wrote the amount left over in a column she'd kept blank for 2 years. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the ledger. She paid the note in full in October. Gruel's clerk processed the transaction without ceremony, issued a receipt, and walked her to the door with the neutral courtesy of a man completing a routine business matter. She rode back from Caldwell in the early afternoon with the receipt in her coat pocket and the specific lightness of having settled something that had been sitting on one side of a scale for 3 years. She did not stop at anyone's farm on the way back. She drove straight home, put the horse up, walked to the eastern slope, walked the length of the rows. The trees had given up their fruit and stood with the particular dignity of trees that have produced their branches lighter now, already directing whatever they had toward the rootwork that would feed next year's cycle. She walked the rows, slowly touching a branch here and there, not looking for anything specific, just looking. At the oldest of the trees, the first whip she'd planted in April of 1888, the one in mound number 3 that she'd rebuilt twice, the one that had been stripped by deer and repacked and fenced and checked again, through 2 full cycles of seasons, she stopped. Its trunk had gone from the diameter of her thumb to something closer to her wrist. The bark had roughened from the smooth, pale skin of a young tree into the beginning of what it would eventually become textured, layered, particular to itself. She put her hand on it. The bark was rough under her palm, warm from the afternoon sun, solid in the way of something that has been tested and remained. She stood there with her hand on the tree and thought about nothing specific for a while, which was its own kind of measure. The autumn of 1891 was the harvest that changed the scale of things. 2 additional seasons of growth had brought the orchard into its full early production, and the 4 correctly layered mounds were now carrying trees that impressed even Ezra Polk, who made his seasonal route through the valley in September and pulled his wagon into the drive without hesitation, spent an hour walking the rows with her, and said at the end of it, in his economy of language, "You got it right." She understood this to be the highest register of praise he was capable of delivering and received it accordingly. She shipped crates to Caldwell for the first time that autumn, arranged through a produce buyer who had heard about the Forsyth orchard from Ward Tully's brother-in-law in a town 40 miles west. The crates went on a wagon she hired from the Tully farm because she did not yet have a wagon large enough for the volume, which was a problem she added to the ledger as a near-term capital expenditure rather than an insurmountable obstacle, because she had learned the difference between those 2 categories in the course of the previous 4 years. Denton Gruel saw the Forsyth wagon on the main street of Caldwell when he happened to be crossing from his office to the hardware merchant. He stood on the boardwalk and watched the crates being unloaded. She saw him from the wagon seat. He nodded once, the small nod of a man acknowledging that a thing he had been uncertain about has resolved in a direction he can respect. She was holding the reins. She did not nod back, not because she was still holding anything against him, but because she was watching the unloading and the reins required her attention, and that was simply where her attention was. She drove home in the early evening with the wagon lighter and the receipt folded in her coat pocket alongside the notebook, which still lived there. She did not think about any of it in particular on the drive. She listened to the rhythm of the horse on the road, watched the flat country on either side go from gold to gray as the sun drop, noticed where the road curved along the dry creek bed and where it straightened toward the Harrow Creek Valley. The years after that moved the way years move when a person has found the work that is actually theirs to do. She did not become wealthy by any measure that would appear in a county record. She became stable, which she had learned was a different thing from wealthy, and in some respects required more. The orchard grew at the pace she managed it, which was the pace she could maintain alone, which she had accepted as the right pace without much resistance, because she'd long since stopped measuring her situation against what it might have been with Harold alive. That was a comparison that served no practical purpose. Ward Tully built his 4 mounds, and they held through 3 subsequent summers. Harlan Stokes built 2, then 4, then asked Mabel in the spring of 1892 if she would walk his slope and look at what he'd done. She did. She corrected 2 errors in his layering, noted them in the margin of her notebook, noted his corrections the following week when he'd fixed them. Clem Birch built 3 mounds on the south side of his property and lost one to a drainage problem she could have warned him about if he'd asked her to look first, which he hadn't, being the kind of man who preferred to learn by doing when possible. He rebuilt the failed mound correctly the following spring. He did not mention this to Agnes or to Mabel. He simply rebuilt it. Agnes Birch died in the spring of 1907 of a heart ailment that had been building for 2 years. Her daughter Vera had taken over the management of the Birch household by then, a practical young woman of 23 who had her mother's efficiency and somewhat less of her mother's certainty about other people's business. At the funeral, Mabel sat in the 3rd row of the Methodist church in Caldwell and looked at the box that held Agnes and thought about the basket of preserves set on a porch step without ceremony and the question delivered in Agnes's flat voice, "I'm asking," and how those 2 things together had contained a complete apology without containing a single word of one. She had understood this at the time. She understood it better now. In the spring of 1910, Vera Birch came to the Forsyth farm on a Tuesday morning. She was 26 now, with the same broad efficiency her mother had carried, and she had a piece of paper in her hand that had been folded and unfolded enough times to be soft at the creases. She knocked at the door and Mabel opened it. Vera held out the paper. "I found this with my mother's things," she said. "She'd kept it in the box with her important papers. I thought you should see it." Mabel took the paper and unfolded it. It was in Agnes's handwriting, the precise hand she'd seen on the commercial inquiry note in August of 1890. It was a copy of the layering specifications from the notebook, the moisture checking instructions, the seasonal notes. Agnes had copied them from the version Ward Tully had made, or possibly from Ward Tully's version directly, and she had kept them in the box with the deed to the Birch farm and the children's birth certificates and the other papers a woman keeps when she's decided something matters. At the bottom of Agnes's copy in smaller writing added at a different time, "A different ink, Vera. This is how. Keep it." Vera looked at her steadily. "I used it," she said. "Last summer when the north section was showing drought stress, I built 2 mounds in March. They held through August." Mabel looked at the paper in her hand. Agnes's handwriting copied from Ward's copy, copied from the notebook, copied from Harold's father's words in Harold's handwriting, in a coat pocket notebook, found by a woman sorting through a dead man's things in June of 1887. She folded the paper back along its worn creases. She held it for a moment. Then she held it out to Vera. "Keep it," Mabel said. Vera took it, looked at her once more and walked back to her wagon. Mabel stood in the doorway until the wagon reached the road. Then she got her coat and walked out to the orchard. The apple trees in 1910 were old enough to have bark like something carved. She walked the rows slowly, not checking anything, not carrying the notebook, just walking. The morning light came in low from the east, the way it always did on the slope, and it moved through the branches the way light moves through things that have been growing long enough to become complicated. At the first tree of the 3rd mound, the old tree, the one rebuilt twice, the one she'd put her hand on, in October of 1890, she stopped. She placed her palm against the bark. It was rougher than it had been 20 years before, the texture of decades of growth thickening over the grain of every season it had come through. Under her hand, the tree was simply there, as it had been through every summer since holding. She stood with her hand on it while the morning light moved across the slope.